So in this session, we'll study one disaccharide, that is maltose, and the polysaccharides called starch, glycogen, and dextrin. Now, maltose is a disaccharide. In earlier session, we studied the remaining disaccharides like sucrose, lactose, and this one is maltose, and this is commonly called malt sugar, and it is formed by the combination of two glucose molecules. So maltose is actually made up of glucose plus glucose, and maltose is important because this is the basic molecule of starch. So starch is actually made up of glucose molecules, or we can say maltose. Now maltose molecules join together in a very large number, and that is going to be formed into a starch. So beta amylase is the enzyme which can break down starch into maltose. So during the digestion, what happens? The starch molecule is broken down by the beta amylase enzyme. So beta amylase is present in saliva and also in the juices, intestinal juice and pancreatic juice, which is secreted into the intestine. So they act on the starch, and when the starch is broken down, it is going to yield maltose, and this maltose is further going to be broken down by the maltase enzyme into glucose and glucose, and this glucose can be used in the by the cells to produce energy. Now maltose is produced during the process of germination. So plants actually store the food in the seeds, and during germination process, what happens? The starch which is stored in the seeds is going to be broken down into maltose, so that the cells, germinating seed is nothing but a plant which is emerging, and the cells are dividing, and the cells need a lot of energy for that process, and they are going to use this maltose as a source of energy. So therefore we can expect the sprouting seeds or germinating seeds contain very large quantity of maltose. And that's why, in our regular food, they advise us to consume the germinating seeds, the sprouting seeds, because they contain simple sugars like maltose, which can be easily digested and which can be easily assimilated. Okay, that's about the maltose. And one more thing, the production of maltose from the germinating cereals is an important part of the brewing process. Now, brewing industry, where alcohol or spirit is produced, uh, uses this technique. So what they do is they break down the starch, and starch is broken down into maltose, and then maltose is going to be broken down into glucose, and glucose enters into the anaerobic respiratory process where alcohol is produced. So therefore maltose is the product which plays an important role in brewing industry also. Then let us move on to the study of polysaccharides. In previous session we studied about polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are very large carbohydrate molecules made up of large number of monomers. And one of the important polysaccharide is starch. Now what is starch? Starch is a white granular organic chemical that is produced by all green plants. Starch is produced by the plants, and it is the stored food material of the plants. Now, starch is a soft, white, tasteless powder. When extracted, we can see that it is soft and it is white in color and it is tasteless, and that is insoluble in cold water, alcohol, or other solvents. So, starch is insoluble because it is a very big molecule. It's made up of hundreds or thousands of monomers of carbohydrates. And the basic chemical formula of the starch molecule is C6H10O5N. Now here N can be any number like 100, 1000, etc. So as I already told you, starch is a very big molecule. Now starch is a polysaccharide comprising glucose monomers joined in alpha 1,4 linkage. So starch is exclusively made up of glucose molecules, and glucose molecules are joined with each other by means of glycosidic bonds, and the position is 1,4 alpha 1,4 linkage. We call it as 1,4 linkages. So one position 1 of one glucose unit and position 4 of another, the neighboring glucose units are joined by means of glycosidic bonds. The simplest form of starch is the linear polymer amylose. Now, we identified two types of starch molecules. One is amylose, another one is amylopectin. So, amylose is unbranched. It is a straight chain made up of glucose molecules. Whereas amylopectin is branched. It shows branching, like a tree branching. So, it shows branching. So, amylose and amylopectins are two different kinds of starch molecules. So where the starch is produced? Now starch is produced in the green leaves. We know that during the process of photosynthesis, the chloroplast is involved in the photosynthesis. So in the cell of the green leaves, photosynthesis occurs in the presence of light, carbon dioxide and water. Now, the glucose, actually fructose is produced in the beginning, and that fructose is converted into glucose, and this glucose is converted into starch molecule, and this starch is stored in different parts of the plant. So you find the uh, starch stored in the leaves, in the fruits, in the seeds, in the roots. So in different plants, starch is stored in different parts of the plant body. And normally that part of the plant body is used as a source of food. We use them as vegetables. For example, in case of rice, wheat, etc., you find starch stored in the seeds. Okay, and in some plants like potato, so it is stored in tubers. So potato tuber is the source of starch. So like this, in some plants, leaves may be rich in starch. So the plant is going to store them in different parts. It depends upon the variety of plant or type of plant. Now, there are two questions. One, why the starch is produced? Because glucose is produced, why it is converted into starch in the plant? Why the plant prefers to store the food in the form of starch? Why not glucose is stored as it is? The thing is, glucose is osmotically active. It actually changes the osmotic property of the cells. So therefore, plants or any cell cannot store glucose because it is osmotically active. It will change the osmotic property of the cell. Therefore, glucose is converted into starch. Now, starch is osmotically inactive because it is insoluble in water and it is osmotically inactive. So therefore, if the glucose is converted into starch, large quantity of starch can be stored in the cell without getting affected. Now, without getting affected to the osmotic property of the cell. Now, that is the reason why the glucose is converted into starch, and starch is the stored food material in the plants. Now, starch is stored in storage organs such as roots of the cassava plant, the tuber of the potato, stem pith of sago, and the seeds of corn, wheat, rice, etc. So, as I already told you, it depends upon the plant. When required, starch is broken down in the presence of certain enzymes and water into its constituent monomer glucose units. So whenever the plant needs glucose, even plant also needs glucose as a source of energy for its metabolic activity. And whenever it requires ATPs, it is going to break down the starch into glucose units, and glucose is metabolized to produce ATPs, and these ATPs are used by the plant for their metabolic activity. In humans and other animals, in animals, starch is not produced, starch is not stored. So we get starch from the plants by eating the plant material in the form of vegetables, in the form of seeds, whatever it is. Normally, we know that our diet, 70% of our diet mainly consists of carbohydrate, and it is nothing but starch. And this starch is digested in the mouth, it is digested in the intestine, and starch is broken down by the amylase enzyme into glucose, and the glucose is absorbed by our bloodstream, and each cell is capable of using this glucose as a source of energy. Now let us go to the glycogen. Now glycogen is another type of polysaccharide. Now, like starch in the plants, glycogen in the animals. So the same sugar. Now only difference is plants are capable of producing sugars like glucose, whereas animals cannot produce fructose or glucose. They get it from the plants. So whenever we consume food items of the plant origin, we get starch, and that starch is digested. So what are the end products of digestion? Glucose. And this glucose, whenever it is in excess, it will be converted into glycogen by some reactions, by some process. And this glycogen is stored mainly in the liver and, in some other organs. So glycogen is the stored food material of animals, and it is almost similar to the uh, starch in its constitution. It is also made up of glucose units only. It is a homopolysaccharide, and uh, this can be considered as the stored food material of animals. Glycogen is mainly stored in the liver and the muscles and provides the body with a readily available source of energy if blood glucose levels decreases. If the sugar is not available in the blood, the liver is going to convert the stored food material into glucose. So that is controlled by two hormones. This process is controlled by two hormones. Insulin will convert glucose into glycogen, whereas glucagon will convert the glycogen into glucose. So we can call it as the glucose homeostasis. Energy can be stored by the body in different forms. One form of stored energy is fat, and glycogen is another. So our body stores fat and glycogen, and here we are talking about carbohydrate, which is glycogen. But fatty acids are more energy rich, but glucose is the preferred energy source for the brain, and glucose can also provide energy for cells in the absence of oxygen. Now, even though the lipid molecules, the fatty acids are source of energy, but some tissues of our body like nervous tissue can use only glucose as a source of energy. Therefore, in general, human body prefers glucose molecules as a source of energy. Now, one more uh, carbohydrate is dextrin. Now, dextrins are not separate molecules. They are group of low molecular weight carbohydrates which are produced by the hydrolysis of starch. Now, as I already mentioned, starch is a very big molecule. When it is broken down by the action of amylase enzyme, the starch is going to give out some small fragments, and those fragments can be considered as dextrins. Now, dextrin is a generic term applied to a variety of products obtained by heating a starch in the presence of a small amount of moisture and an acid. Now, dextrins are made by starch, okay, and they can be classified as white dextrins or yellow dextrins and British gums. Now, they are water soluble and produces less viscous solutions, and compared to starch, they are less viscous. They produce less viscous solution. Now, yellow dextrins are used as water soluble glues in they're used as gums to used in envelope adhesives and paper tubes, etc. White dextrins are used as crispness enhancer for food processing in the food batters, coatings, glazes, and also in textile finishing and coating agent to increase weight and stiffness of textile fabrics. So we can say dextrins are not natural products. They are produced by breaking starch into fragments, and the dextrin uh, is having some applications in industrial applications like the production of gums and food processing, and also in textile industry.